Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and I apologize for a slightly late start as we were working through some technical difficulties, but we will jump right into our 2018 to 2019 NCFCA webinar. The goal of NCFCA webinars is to facilitate a platform where thought leaders and subject matter experts can provide insight on topics relevant to current debate resolutions and speech events. Our desire is to provide a platform that encourages mentorship, real-life application, and competitive excellence. Our intention for this webinar is to help provide educational context for the debate topic from our guest speaker's specific area of expertise. Please keep this framework in mind as you craft your questions, and take advantage of the fact that you have an opportunity to interact with someone who can provide subject matter expertise regarding the debate topic of the United States federal government's foreign policy towards international terrorism. The format for this evening's webinar will begin with a 30-minute presentation from our very special guest speaker, Dr. Stan Watson, and this presentation will be followed by a giveaway hosted by your friends at NCFCA. In this giveaway, we will be presenting a hoodie sweatshirt to two individuals who have demonstrated excellent engagement by submitting questions via the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your panel. So please do participate throughout the webinar by submitting your questions during the presentation, as we will be fielding those in preparation for the 15-minute live Q&A session that will follow the giveaway. During this time, Dr. Watson and Dr. Ravi Paul will have a conversation to respond to the questions that you have submitted through the presentation. And so please do submit these questions. If you have any technical difficulties, you can submit a request for help in the chat function that is also available on your screen. And our webinar tech support team is on the back end and ready to help you in any way that they can. So at this point, it is my honor to invite Dr. Ravi Paul to join us all on screen as I introduce him to you this evening. So Dr. Paul is our NCFCA host. He is an Associate Professor of Management Information Systems in the College of Business at East Carolina University. He earned both his master's and PhD in Industrial Management from Clemson University after completing his Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Bangalore University. Dr. Paul is also an NCFCA parent, debate coach, and a member of the NCFCA Debate Committee, so we are thrilled to have him here with us this evening. Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Thank you, Natalia. Thanks for the introduction. It is indeed a pleasure to introduce Dr. Watson to us. Dr. Watson, Stan Watson, has served as an intelligence analyst with the FBI for more than 10 years, focusing most of that time on strategic analysis of terrorist threats to the US and our interests overseas. He also teaches classes on international terrorism for the FBI's National Academy at Quantico, Virginia. Before joining the FBI, Dr. Watson spent more than 7 years teaching political science at the college level and 4 years as a public policy analyst for a think tank in Alabama. Since joining the FBI, he has taught as an adjunct for Liberty University's Master of Public Policy program, including courses on US foreign policy in the Middle East. He holds a master's and PhD in political science from Emory University and a bachelor's degree from Clemson University. He lives with his wife of 30 years in Lovettsville, Virginia, and has 3 adult children who often get tired of hearing him pontificate about Islamic extremism and Middle Eastern politics. It is my pleasure and honor to invite Dr. Watson, who's a good friend and a great contributor to this year's debate topic. So, Stan, thank you for being here. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Robbie. Appreciate that introduction. I guess I should add to that introduction that I'm also a former NCFCA dad. My son competed in events with you guys a few years back. So I know a little bit about how the process works. And I know that in the team policy event, as I understand it, you don't really know before you start the debate exactly what tack your opponent is going to take on the issue that you're debating. So I thought what would be most helpful to you in this format would be to try to just break down, as I see it, what our policy is, and then some of the issues that get raised in relation to those different aspects of our policy regarding international terrorism. So I want to begin, before I jump into that, by saying that I'm speaking here just as a private citizen, as an academic who's studied these issues. I'm not speaking in any way as a spokesman for the FBI or for any government agency. So the opinions and assessments that I'm presenting here are completely my own. They are not to be considered the opinion or views of the FBI in any way. So just to make that clear, first off, and now I guess can get into the substance here. So your resolution is that the U.S. federal government should substantially change its foreign policy regarding international terrorism. Of course, I guess the first question you have to answer in that case is, what is our policy? And the fact is we have multiple policies that are directed at the problem of international terrorism. So I want to try to break those down into three basic areas that I think they can be looked at in sort of a systematic way. So the three basic areas, one is that part of our policy is to use the extensive powers of our intelligence and law enforcement agencies to identify terrorists and disrupt terrorist plots. So that involves all of our intelligence collection efforts overseas, monitoring communications, talking with human sources, and all the different ways that we collect intelligence from open source issues, and then analyzing that information to try to identify plots and plotters. And then I would say that also includes our efforts to screen visitors and immigrants to the United States against the databases that we have to try to identify if a person is coming to this country who might want to do us harm. And then it also includes, when we do identify a person through those means, it includes our investigation and then prosecution of those people, or deportation of those people if they're an immigrant and it's not easiest sometimes to do a full-blown criminal trial. We may simply deport such a person if he's been identified. So that's the intelligence law enforcement aspect of it. The second aspect of our policy on terrorism, I would categorize as the areas in which we use the extensive powers of our military and also our diplomatic establishments to try to deny terrorist groups safe havens around the world that they can operate from. So this includes things like full-scale invasion of countries, as we invaded Afghanistan, for example, in order to deny Al-Qaeda that safe haven that they were able to use before they attacked us on 9/11. But it also includes our efforts to go after terrorists in these places without a full-scale invasion. And I'm sure you've heard and seen in the news about how we use things like drones, armed drones, to go after terrorists in some of these places like Yemen and Pakistan, to again, deny them safe haven there, to keep them in a position where they're not able to really plot attacks against us. It also includes our efforts to work with foreign governments as well to help them go after groups and individuals within their borders that may be threatening us and the rest of the world. So obviously, if we can get international partners to go after these individuals in their own countries, that's a lot easier than us trying to go after those individuals with our capabilities. So we spend a lot of time working with foreign partners, trying to develop their capabilities, training their people, and sharing intelligence information with them to help identify people and that sort of thing. And then the third aspect of our efforts to fight terrorism, I would say, can be categorized as our efforts to shut down platforms used by terrorist groups to disseminate their propaganda and countering their extremist messaging where possible. So this is the propaganda and counter messaging part of the terrorism policy. We try to identify media platforms. So if we find out they're using a particular website or social media account to disseminate propaganda and communicate with potential plotters, we probably will shut that down. It also, though, includes our efforts to promote counter messaging, where we try to present a counter argument to what they're promoting as the reasons to attack the West and that sort of thing. So in those three areas, you could break them down even further into individual things we do under each of those headings. But I wanted to sort of use that as our framework and then look at each of those areas in turn as to what are some of the issues that get raised about the way we go after terrorists. So I'm trying to anticipate what kinds of things I would think a debate team might try to argue about these various areas. And I'll give you a little bit of my thoughts on those things as we go along. So first of all, in the first area of intelligence and law enforcement approaches, there are lots of arguments and issues raised about the way that's done. Probably the most common argument you've probably even heard, I'm sure you've heard this discussed, is questions being raised about the scope of our intelligence collection. That we are, some people think we're eavesdropping on everybody's phone calls and we're collecting too much information about people and people's privacy is being violated. So I can imagine that one approach a debate team might take is to argue that we need to change our policies with regard to the way we collect intelligence information and to increase the safeguards for individual privacy. And I certainly understand that view. I guess I would just say in response to that, that from the standpoint of those who are trying to find the bad guys, those are the tools we use to find them. And so the more you limit and hamper the ability to use those tools, the harder you make it to find the needle in the haystack. Often the FBI and the federal government in general has been criticized for failing to connect the dots before 9/11 that would have prevented that attack. And of course, our intelligence collection operations are what allow us to connect the dots. We have to collect the dots in order to connect the dots. So, if you're in that sort of a debate, I think there's a lot of response you can give in terms of how this information is necessary to keep us safe. A big aspect of this, of course, has been the arguments about the metadata collection. That there's been talk about how the government collects phone records, not the content of phone calls, but the records of what numbers called what numbers and for how long, and where those numbers may have been located. That metadata collection is, again, a very important part of connecting the dots and figuring out who's connected to whom. If you identify a person who may be a threat, you want to know who else is he communicating with. And, you know, the Justice Department has argued, and I think it's a valid argument, that the metadata involved here is actually not protected by the Fourth Amendment. So you'll probably get an argument that the metadata collection violates the Fourth Amendment. It's an unreasonable search and seizure of information, but the Justice Department's position has been, and I agree with it, that the Fourth Amendment is intended to collect your own personal information that's in your own personal possession. Information that you give to a third party is actually not protected by the Fourth Amendment. So when you contract with a cell phone company to buy their service, and you know they're charging you based on the calls you make and the numbers of calls you make and where those calls are located, you know you're giving to that cell phone company all that data about the calls you're making and where they're located and how long you talk to them and that sort of thing. So you've given that to a third party, and the government's position has been that the Fourth Amendment doesn't protect stuff that you give to a third party. So that's the argument that can be made in response to that, and you have to flush that out as you look into it. And I would also note that while it's important in identifying the bad guys, it's also important to be able to use this data to rule out people. So in some ways, in some cases, it can be very beneficial to be able to rule out somebody as a suspect before we start engaging in even more intrusive investigative techniques against that person. So while you may be disturbed by a collection of metadata, you would probably be even more disturbed if there was additional things done because we didn't have that metadata. So that's one of those things that gets argued about a lot. And then, of course, the other aspect of this that often gets raised in the current debate is the way we're approaching terrorism these days. And a lot of people feel that we're relying too much on the law enforcement function to go after terrorists and not enough on our war-making functions. And so the argument is made that terrorists are people who basically declared war on the United States. It doesn't make sense to treat them as criminal suspects who are awarded all sorts of rights of due process in our system when they're actually enemy combatants that should be, met through military responses, not a law enforcement response. So I think you may get some people arguing that's the way we need to change our foreign policy on terrorism. We need to move more to military response and less use of criminal justice due process type systems. Even if that were the case, we still deal with the fact that many people that we deal with in this realm are domestic individuals who would have to be treated as criminal suspects anyway. So, I would say a better argument is how can we streamline the process, make it work better? How can we possibly create special terrorism courts, for example, to deal with enemy combatants from overseas that actually can deal with those issues and use classified information and things of that nature. And I guess the third area you get a lot of argument about is the invasion of privacy by the TSA when they search you going through the airport. And there's certainly arguments to be made, about how intrusive those searches can be, and you may run up against that as part of one of the things you have to respond to. Let me move on to the next area, which is the military and diplomatic approaches, where we try to deny terrorists the safe havens overseas so that they can attack us. Obviously, one of the biggest arguments against that or arguments in opposition to that is that people don't like, things like full-scale military invasions to go after one small terrorist group. And so you're probably going to get some of the teams arguing that the problem with our current policy is that we are invading too many countries, with too many troops overseas trying to fight these groups. I guess my response to that would be that, in my experience at least, I see that withdrawal usually encourages more attacks by the groups that we're going after, and that advancing against those groups keeps them occupied in their own country and limits their ability to reach out and strike us. So I think withdrawal and retreat from those areas is not going to lessen the threat that we face from these groups. And I would also argue that a military defeat of a terrorist group is probably the most effective way to discredit its leaders and to discredit its whole reason for being, so that nobody wants to join that group. And I would just, along those lines, ask you to consider the caliph of the Sudanese caliphate that arose in Sudan in the 1880s and 1890s. See, the ISIS caliphate in Syria is not actually the first time we had a jihadist group declare a caliphate. There was one that declared a caliphate in the 1880s in Sudan and took over that country and began taking over parts of Ethiopia and Egypt. And you probably never heard of it because the British military went in and eventually completely defeated and destroyed that group. And so you never really hear about those guys anymore. And I would say that's often the most effective way to eliminate the threat from a terrorist group. And I would also say that, when this argument is raised, it's commonly said that, well, this is the problem of those countries over there who are dealing with it, let them handle it. And the truth is, they really aren't capable. Our military capabilities are so far beyond those of our partners that it really, when you try to leave things to our partners, you find that they just don't do it very well. But that's another argument as well. There's also, of course, opposition to the more targeted efforts that we do with, like, drones. So you probably get an argument about that, as we need to stop these drone strikes because we're killing too many civilians, and it's the civilian deaths that create blowback against us. I would argue that the problem of blowback is probably exaggerated, as are the alleged civilian casualties from these attacks. And I can tell you, from the example of Yemen, for example, we're really seeing a decrease in the threat from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, because we've gone after their leaders so effectively with drone strikes. And the blowback has not made that group stronger. It's actually not been enough to counteract the effectiveness of our campaign. So much so that, recently, one of their supporters put out on social media that AQAP was now pursuing a strategy of hibernation that was going to drive their enemies crazy because they wouldn't be able to get them. And of course, from our perspective, we like when they pursue a strategy of hibernation. We want them to hibernate as much as possible. So I feel like when we make them feel like they need to hibernate, we're probably doing a good job. Third area of this type of policy is the issue of the kinds of countries that we're dealing with and working with to try to, as I say, we try to work with our foreign partners and strengthen their counterterrorism capabilities. And that means we're working with partners who sometimes are corrupt or sometimes not fully committed to the counterterrorism goal, who may consider certain groups to be a terrorist that they'll go after, and certain groups that they think are good terrorists, or at least terrorists that don't need to be eliminated. And then there's lots of issues related there. But again, the response to that is, what is the alternative? You can't, we can't go around and restructure all the governments in the region in order to make them less corrupt and more democratic and able to respond to these threats in the way we'd like them to. Then the third area I mentioned is, again, the counter messaging strategies. And we do have a lot of issues on that. So you may see debate teams arguing that we need to do more to counter the message of extremists. And I would say that I think we all want to see that done effectively, but it's very difficult to do in our society. First of all, it's difficult for the U.S. government, which does not believe in the establishment of religion. It's difficult for I would say not believe, is prohibited from engaging in the establishment of religion. And so it's difficult for our government to be in the position of trying to tell Muslims, well, you shouldn't believe that kind of Islam, you should believe this kind of Islam, because that puts us in the situation of endorsing one particular religion over another, or brand of religion over another. So the counter messaging strategy is very difficult for the U.S. government for that very reason. And for that reason, we tend to try to work with Islamic groups that we consider to be moderate and try to support them as they counter the messages of extremist groups. And of course, that brings us into this issue of, well, maybe we're supporting the wrong Islamic groups because some of them are extremist in their own way, and why are we supporting this group to help us message against extremism when you can show that this group was extremist in this way or that way. And again, those you could get valid arguments about that, but it's also because the government, it can't really do these things directly. We have to find partners to work with, and it's difficult. And I would say there's also often a complaint that we just don't do enough counter messaging. And again, I say that's because it's difficult to do and still respect religious freedom and freedom of speech issues. But I would agree that the U.S. government could do a better job of publicizing things like Americans who went to join ISIS and found out it was really a crappy group to be involved in, and they really had a horrible time there, and became very disillusioned with their experience. And I think, giving those people a platform to tell how bad it was can be an effective strategy, and maybe we need to do that more. I think we certainly need to do more to talk about and reiterate as much as possible how many Muslims are killed by terrorist groups, because the vast majority of their victims are fellow Muslims, not infidels, as they would call us. And so I think in countering terrorism, it's effective to show that these groups that claim they're fighting for Islam are actually killing more Muslims than non-Muslims, and are not, helping the Ummah. They're hurting the Ummah, which is the Islamic nation. So those are kind of the areas you see arguments made. I'm going to throw out a few areas that I would like to see improvements in. In the intelligence and law enforcement realm, I would say, first of all, from the law enforcement perspective, the encryption technologies today are really making it very difficult for law enforcement to go after and identify people, and even when we know that we have a person who's engaging in criminal or terrorist acts, and we may have an order from a federal judge to monitor their communications. We met all the requirements of the Fourth Amendment, but we can't break into their phone or break into their communications because of encryption. So one proposal would be, which has been made by the FBI and other organizations, is to require telecommunications companies and computer companies to provide a sort of a backdoor key for law enforcement to be able to use when they have a legitimate court order and that meets all the requirements of probable cause in the Fourth Amendment. And again, as I mentioned before, I think the creation of special courts can be effective. We've tried to create military courts to deal with the Guantanamo Bay detainees, and it's not really been a success yet. That system needs to be reformed and made to actually work. I think we can do more in terms of what's been called extreme vetting, where we really go in and question people more before we give them visas and before we allow them to enter the U.S. To ask them questions about, whether you believe democratic governance is compatible with Islam, for example. Do you believe that only Sharia law is the truly legitimate law? Do you believe that someone who converts from Islam to some other religion deserves death? We don't ask those kind of questions, but I think the argument can be made that people who answer those questions in an extremist way probably shouldn't be given the privilege of being able to come visit our country. The military and diplomatic approaches, an issue that I think probably does need to be addressed is renewal of the authorization for the use of military force, which has been called, it's called the AUMF. This is the act that was passed by Congress to authorize our military to go after Al-Qaeda and the groups that Al-Qaeda and their allies, basically. It was passed in 2001 and hasn't been revised since. And so I would agree with those who say that we need to reform and renew the AUMF, but that's a difficult issue. And as I mentioned, I do think we can do a better job of counterterrorism or counter messaging in areas like I mentioned, where we reiterate over and over again, daily totals of how many have been killed, how many Muslims have been killed by so-called Islamic terrorists, and where we promote and give a platform to those who have left terrorist groups and can expose the lies and the fraud that those groups really are. And I think there's groups that do good work that we need to provide more support for. For example, Zuhdi Jasser, who runs the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. I think he does great work, and I'd like to see us help give him more of a platform, and maybe less working with groups like the Council for American Islamic Relations, or CARE. So those are some of the issues. Those are some of my responses to the issues, and I'm happy to take some questions now from you. Robbie?
Thank you, Stan. That was incredibly. I'm trying to think of the right word. Comprehensive, perhaps, is the right word. Thank you so much for laying out those areas. We are gathering. We've had an incredible array of questions. Thank you so much for all the participants that have send in your questions. We have over close to 70 questions that have come in.
Oh, wow.
Yes, I hope you're ready for this
Yeah.
barrage.
How long is this going to go?
But before we do that, I believe Natalia has a message and some giving away of gifts coming our way. Natalia?
Yes, I do. I have a message and some giving away of gifts. So let's start off with the giveaway. As Dr. Paul mentioned, we have a wonderful audience, and you all really did a fantastic job of submitting some very thoughtful questions. So I'm excited to see the live Q&A in just a couple of minutes here. Now I am going to announce our winners of the giveaway. Tonight's winners are Emma and Shante, and there aren't last names listed. So Emma and Shante, if you could please drop your email addresses into the chat, that will just go privately to the host, myself, and to the other panelists, and we'll make sure that you receive your giveaway of an NCFCA hoodie. Thank you again for submitting your questions. Moving forward, just a really brief reminder of some of the resources that NCFCA has developed to equip you in your research and debate journey. We have the team policy debate curriculum, and you can find that by going to our website, ncfca.org. Browse over to the resources section. You can learn more about this fantastic curriculum. For those of you who have friends in value debate, you can tell them to be excited because the writing of value debate curriculum is underway and will be ready for the 2019 to 2020 season, which will be next year. So that's very exciting to announce. We also have our speech curriculum for those of you who are looking to level up your speech skills. All of that is available on our website. Just quick reminder, follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and make sure that you're receiving our newsletter, because that's where we will be sending out the webinar schedules. Our next webinar is actually this upcoming Monday, October 1st at 6 p.m. And that will be sponsored by the King's College. It will be an LD topic webinar. So we will give team policy a quick break so you can digest all of this wonderful information and switch over to LD. So with that, thank you for all of your questions. We are going to move back into the discussion between Dr. Paul and Dr. Watson. Definitely have your laptop or pen or pencil and paper out and ready, because you're going to want to take some good notes.
Thank you, Natalia. Stan, I'm trying to sort of comprehend how to put all of these questions in here in a way that we can try and address most of them. We're going to give it a shot. But I'm going to try and summarize some of the things, some of the questions the participants have asked, and would love to hear your thoughts on it. And I apologize to the panel, to the participants if we don't get to your question. I'm sorry, just time constraints. So I'm going to start off with sort of, I think, a really broad question that's embedded within some of the questions that we received, is if you can address, can we actually separate religion and terrorism, in your opinion?
Well, yes, we can. Well, I guess my first answer to that would be, you know, in the FBI and in the U.S. government, intelligence and defense departments, we employ many Muslims. I work alongside many Muslims who help us go after Muslim extremists, help us stop their efforts to promote jihad against the West. While I don't agree with those who would say, oh, this terrorism has nothing to do with Islam, I do think that the terrorists present one interpretation of Islam that is not completely, you know, detached from historical understandings of what Islam has meant through the centuries. It's not the only interpretation of Islam that can comport with the history of the religion, and we're not going to eliminate the religion of Islam from the face of the earth. So we really have to try to find a way to work with and promote moderate Muslims against the extremist Muslims who, promote this jihadist ideology.
Okay. Yeah. So, thank you. As related to that aspect, couple of sort of follow-up questions to that. One is, do you think that military force is the best way to solve our terrorism problems? And two, what can you talk a little bit more about potential blowback from those military attacks and how it plays a role in what we're seeing and what we'll continue to see?
Okay, so I think, as I mentioned, let me put it this way: in tackling the problem of Islamic extremism, okay, there's certainly a role, as I said, for counter messaging and trying to counter the message of Islamic extremists. But the average Muslim doesn't have a deep understanding of the theological and doctrinal issues anyway, so you can make the best doctrinal and theological arguments against extremism, and it's just going to go right over that person's head. What often influences people is not that they've really examined the ideology of a group and determined that it comports with Islam as they understand it, but that they've seen a group that appears to be successful, that appears to have successfully carried out attacks against the West, successfully taken over territory, successfully set up some kind of Sharia-based government in that territory. And really, the only way to convince people at the mass level that this group is not worth joining or devoting your resources to is to defeat that group on the battlefield, so that the argument is not, I don't know whether you agree with the ideology they were putting out or not, but they obviously, whatever they're putting out doesn't work because it's just getting people killed and getting territory destroyed. So I certainly don't think you can eliminate either aspect of that equation. We need to be countering the message, but we also need to be making sure that individual groups don't get the reputation of being a strong, successful group that is attacking the West with impunity.
Right. So I'm thinking of the second option that you mentioned, military and diplomatic means to counter terrorism. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of two aspects of that? Is one being surveillance kind of issues that we're doing within the United States to address that, and also how we're working with other governments around the world with that particular objective in mind.
Well, we do work with a lot of foreign partners. We do have intelligence sharing relationships with a lot of foreign governments. I can't obviously go into any detail on what those are, but they're vital partners in this battle. And governments that you might think are not really friendly to the U.S. at the intelligence and counterterrorism level work very closely with the U.S. in many cases. And that's a very important part of the equation.
So what about foreign aid and the connections to foreign aid and its relationship with us fighting with terrorism?
That's a good question. I think it's a difficult question. Obviously, countries in the region, one of the reasons that people, let's just take Yemen, for example, okay? Yemen is the poorest Arab country, and certainly its poverty and lack of effective governance has made it a safe haven for terrorist groups. And so one approach to dealing with the problem of Yemen is we need more aid to Yemen society, humanitarian aid and government aid to bolster that government and help it to govern and feed its own people. But I would also say that wealthy, well-fed, prosperous individuals also join terrorist organizations. One of them being Osama bin Laden himself, who comes from one of the richest families in the Middle East. So I think we need to do more to help countries like Yemen, but I don't think even if we were doing everything we could, that would eliminate the problem of people being attracted to this ideology, even if they're not, in dire straits financially, whatever.
Yeah. So I'm thinking Pakistan is another example of that.
Yes.
So it seems like what I'm reading in the news and stuff, aid is an important issue for Pakistan, and they want our aid. But at the same time, is it really getting us what we want as far as cooperation from them?
Yeah, and that goes to the issue I raised, that we end up having to work with partners that are not always the most desirable partners to be working with, and they don't always seem to be entirely on our side. But still, again, at the intelligence and counterterrorism level, we often get a lot of very effective cooperation from some of those same countries. So, right now they're trying to sort of compel Pakistan to get a little tougher by holding some aid, and that may be an effective strategy. We're just going to have to see how that plays out.
Yeah. So moving on to a slightly different topic, Stan, can you talk a little more? I know you talked about the Fourth Amendment and protection afforded by the Fourth Amendment with search and seizure. Can you talk a little more and extend those kinds of rights, like due process? And what about, you spoke about extreme vetting as an option. How does that play a role as far as, are there racial and religious discrimination issues that come up? So just talk about those rights that we are all so familiar with and that are so dear to us. How does that play a role in our war against terrorism?
That's a great question. So first of all, the rights of a criminal defendant in the United States are designed for citizens of the United States, in criminal cases. Enemy combatants who attack us on the battlefield don't get the presumption of innocence, don't get the guarantee of probable cause before we go after and raid their facilities. And certainly, in World War II, we didn't have to go to a federal judge in order to get a warrant to tap the phones of the Nazi high command. Okay, that's That's an essential part of the war-making function, is that you try to intercept the communications of the enemy. So we've got groups that have, as I say, declared war on us. They're engaged in a war against us, and yet we've given them in some ways these judicial protections against things that we would never in a normal war. We never require a court order, as I say, to tap the phones of the Nazi high command. So a lot of this whole issue boils down to, do you think we're at war or not? Do you think this is a war, or is this just some criminals that we need to arrest? If you think it's a criminal matter, then yeah, obviously you're going to feel like all the due process guarantees should be involved. But if you understand it as a war, which is what our government has done by declaring war in the authorization for the use of military force that I mentioned earlier, then the laws of war apply, not the laws of criminal due process. The other aspect of that I want to address is the extreme vetting. Again, the rights of criminal due process apply to citizens in the United States. They do not apply to non-citizens applying to enter the country. Actually, I would argue that a foreign citizen wanting to come here has no right to any particular religious belief. At least under our Constitution, there's no, that I see, any constitutional bar on eliminating persons because they have exhibited extremist religious beliefs. There are policy issues and prudence issues, and it may not be politically popular, and a politician who does that may find himself voted out of office. But I don't think it's a constitutional issue, because non-citizens don't have those constitutional rights.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you for clarifying that distinction. For everybody's just knowledge, I asked Dr. Watson if he was okay with extending his time just a little bit longer, based on the number of questions we have and the fascinating information that we're getting from him, and he has graciously agreed. So I'm going to press on and try to get to some of the meat of some of the other questions that we had. But thank you for doing that, Stan. I appreciate that. So sort of along the same lines, can you speak a little more about the AUMF and the Patriot Act and their roles in our fight against international terrorism?
Well, okay, so the AUMF was passed by Congress after 9/11, and it authorized the use of military force to go after those groups and individuals responsible for the 9/11 attack. And as we all know, the Al-Qaeda organization was the group responsible. So it was a declaration of war on Al-Qaeda. The laws of war say that if you're engaged in a war with an enemy power, and that enemy power makes alliances with others powers to fight against you, then you don't actually have to have a new declaration of war for the Allies, although often we did. In World War II, we did pass additional declarations of war against some of the Allies, the Nazis and the Japanese. But under the laws of war, that's not necessary. And so that's been the method by which other groups have sort of been added to the AUMF. So it started with Al-Qaeda. It now includes ISIS, but that's because ISIS began as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And so it began as an Al-Qaeda franchise that then broke away from Al-Qaeda, but it still started as a franchise. So because it was part of the group that we were at war with, then we're at war with them too. But as time goes on and more groups become allied and then therefore brought within the meaning of the AUMF, it does get unwieldy, shall we say. And so a lot of people have said that we should pass more specific AUMFs for each of these new groups that we are going after now. And that's certainly, constitutionally, I think that's a good thing. Tactically, it can be a difficult thing because we may not want to reveal the intelligence that tells us that this group is actually allied with Al-Qaeda. We may not even want to, if we have a list of the groups we are designating as those that we're at war with, it could become a sort of a badge of honor among the jihadists to get on the list. And so there's been some reluctance to do that for that reason. But I think, as a legal constitutional matter, we're now, 17 years out from 9/11, and maybe we need to update the authorities that we are operating under. The Patriot Act, I think, has been oversold. I don't think it revolutionized our authorities as much as people think it did. It clarified that certain authorities we had did apply to this particular situation. But I guess I'd rather answer specific questions about the Patriot Act, because in general, I don't see the Patriot Act as any sort of revolutionary piece of legislation, although it's been treated that way.
Okay, sure, fair enough. Let's switch tracks a little bit and sort of focus on the propaganda, social media messaging, that aspect of it. How much of that can we control without violating rights, constitutional rights, or things of that nature?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult thing, because we do have a free society with a right to religious freedom. And so, we see examples like, you probably heard about the group in New Mexico that were raising their kids to apparently try to carry out attacks in schools.
Yep.
That individual was the son of an Islamic preacher in the New York area who's well known to be pretty hardline Islamist, but was not advocating violent attack on the United States. So you can't, some people are saying, how was this group allowed to go as long as it was, and why wasn't the father rolled up years ago, because he was supposedly an unindicted co-conspirator in the 1993 Twin Towers bombing, which is also a misconception. So yeah, there are a multitude of issues we run into. So we have to make the bottom line actually advocating violent attack. We can't outlaw, just fundamentalist Islam.
Yeah.
Because that's right. Not the way our system works.
Yeah.
So.
What about social media stuff, Stan? Do you, how effective has the messaging from the other side been? Are they making better use of social media than we are? Can we do a better job? And what are some ways that we can do that?
Well, one of the ways that they are very effectively using social media now is through some of these encrypted apps that now allow you to create, sort of online, like web chat groups within, WhatsApp or Telegram or whatever the program is. And so yeah, we it used to be a lot easier actually to find, internet forums where extremists were exchanging ideas and plotting and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Uh, Now it's a lot harder to even find them, and that's why, again, we like to see sort of backdoor ways to get around encryption when it's necessary from a law enforcement
Yeah.
perspective.
Hmm. So if you were suddenly given the status of Jack Ryan, the CIA analyst, whatever,
Yeah, that's exactly what analysts do all the time.
wave the magic wand, and you can pick uh, uh, three strategies in the three areas that you sort of broke it down for us, as far as the most effective strategies or policies that you would consider in those areas. What would they be?
Again, these are just opinions on my part.
Yeah.
So, my views are pretty idiosyncratic, probably. um, well, I guess I'm going to say that one of the biggest problems I think we do have is that the military commission system that they try to set up to deal with the Guantanamo cases has not worked. It needs to be reformed and streamlined and made workable, because even though I would argue that, see, and here's this thing about, are we engaged in a law enforcement operation, or are we at war? Because the laws of war say
Yeah.
that when you capture enemy combatants on the battlefield, they can be kept as prisoners of war until hostilities end.
Yep.
Okay? There's no time limit on that except the length of the conflict itself.
Mm-hmm.
And when the prisoners of war are released under the laws of war is when the two sides finally come to a truce and make a peace settlement or a treaty with each other. Well, obviously, Al-Qaeda is never going to surrender and make a peace treaty with the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason these guys have no end date to their captivity is that they signed up to join an organization that's never going to surrender.
Mm-hmm.
That's not our fault. They signed up for that. They signed up for forever war when they signed up to join Al-Qaeda. So in that aspect, there's no violation of the laws of war to keep those guys till they die a natural death. But I think it is still sort of offensive to our American sensibilities that we would keep people captive indefinitely without them actually being convicted through some kind of due process system. And so I do think we need to create a military commission system that actually works and can, deal with those cases and impose sentences and keep Guantanamo operating, because I think it serves a very important function in the war on terror. I'm not with those who want to see it closed.
Yeah. So would you say, I'm kind of hearing, and based on my reading and stuff as well, it seems like one of the big difficulties we have, other than the fact that I think you identified one, I really think one of the difficulties is the issue of, is this a criminal justice issue or is this a war issue? And that's a big separator of a lot of things, and how you apply policies and how rights and constitutionality and all that. Would you say the other sort of difficult aspect is trying to work with actual terrorist attacks versus potential threats of terrorist attacks? And how do you incorporate both of those and deal with them so as to be more proactive and preemptive rather than deal with the consequences of an attack?
Well, yes, that's the dilemma we face, because the FBI, through much of its history, was basically a law enforcement organization that responded to crimes after they were committed, and was very effective at finding the perpetrators and bringing them to justice.
Yeah.
We now, in the post 9/11 world, are expected to not only find terrorists who committed terrorist acts, but find them before they commit terrorist acts and stop them. And it's difficult. And one of the ways we do that, and that's another area that gets criticized, is we've often used informants that get close to a person who's already been identified as someone who's talking about maybe engaging in terrorism. And then arrange for an informant to talk to that person and say, oh, you really want to do something? Hey, I got a friend who's with Al-Qaeda, and he can provide you with an explosive backpack, and you can take this and set it in a location, and we'll give you a cell phone, and you dial this number and it'll explode. And of course it's a fake bomb and a fake cell phone, and once it's been given to this individual and he's placed it, he then is arrested. Well, then you get accused of entrapment, right? That you've entrapped a person into terrorism. So it's pretty hard. We're trying to stop the bad guys before they act, but they have to do certain overt things before we can actually bring charges against them. So you have to bring in the informant to try to see if they'll do certain overt things, and then, oh, well, you're entrapping this guy. So it's a constant dilemma.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're kind of running out of time. If you were to share, what would your recommendations be in terms of sources or books or articles or areas that you would recommend our debaters sort of take a deep dive into to sort of fully get a good picture of international terrorism and how the U.S. policies can be used to affect them?
That's a good question. I wish I'd thought about that more. My first response is I'm a big fan of Andrew McCarthy, who's a former federal prosecutor who's written a book called Willful Blindness about what he sees as some of the blind spots in our counterterrorism regime. So I would recommend that as a good resource. That's the first one that comes to mind, but I have to think.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there.
No, I should have thought of it. That's a great question.
But what we would appreciate is if you take some time and if some sources come to mind, you think would be useful, if you could send it to me, we can make it available to all our debaters, and that would be appreciated as well. So,
yeah, I'll see if I can do that.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds great. Thank you so much, Stan. I know I have learned a lot, even though we had this conference a month ago or 2 months ago, I forget, but always a pleasure and very informative, at least to me, and I hope the participants did as well. Thank you for taking your time. Natalia?
Yeah, thank you. It was great fun. I enjoyed it. Good luck to all your debaters.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Watson, and thank you, Dr. Paul, and thank you to all of our attendees. Again, you blow me away constantly with all of your great questions and engagement on these topics. So we hope that this has been helpful to you in preparation for the 2018 to 2019 team policy topic, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Make sure to check your emails because we will send you a link once we collect some resources from Dr. Watson regarding some future research that you can do on this topic. So we'll be uploading that to the NCFCA resource library on the website, but we will send you an email first since you were our loyal attendees this evening. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful evening. A quick final reminder on the NCFCA side, if your family has not already affiliated for the 2018 to 2019 competition season, remember that early bird affiliation ends this Sunday, September 30th at midnight. And keep in mind that your affiliation by that day actually affects your region's slots for nationals potentially. So if your family has not affiliated yet, remind them, log in on the NCFCA website, and we look forward to seeing you this competition season. So good night.
Thank you, Natalia. Good night. Thank you, Stan. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks.